it's based on this idea that there's something wrong with difference. And we don't think of it that way. But if I tell my child, don't notice color, I'm giving them this message that there must be something wrong or bad with color, right? And typically when we say that, we're talking about darker skinned people. And so subconsciously what our children hear is, oh, there's something wrong with having dark skin. We're going to be nice and not point that out, right?
The first thing that you really bring up in the book that was like an aha moment for me was around this idea of colorblind parenting. Can you talk a little bit about what that is and where it comes from?
I mean, what so-called colorblind parenting is this, or colorblind, even if it's not parenting, colorblind thinking is this notion that not only can we be taught not to see difference or see colors, which is in the United States tends to be a proxy for race, though it's of course more complicated than that. But we shouldn't see color because it's bad to see color, and it's a win if we just look at people's humanity without noticing color. And I think in some ways, the best sort of intention I can put on it is it comes out of a misreading of what Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was talking about when he said, I don't want to be judged by the color of my skin, but the content of my character. I think so-called colorblindness is kind of a very, very serious misreading of that, based on also misunderstanding that if we just stopped noticing color, racism would go away. So coming out of the civil rights movement, but it's never been an adequate or a fair interpretation of what King or other civil rights activists were talking about.
What does colorblind parenting do to our kids' psychology that might be problematic? So in other words, what's wrong with the colorblind outlook?
It's based on this idea that there's something wrong with difference. And we don't think of it that way. But if I tell my child, don't notice color, I'm giving them this message that there must be something wrong or bad with color, right? And typically when we say that, we're talking about darker skinned people. And so subconsciously what our children hear is, oh, there's something wrong with having dark skin. We're going to be nice and not point that out, right? And so it's this very, very powerful but subliminal message that there's something wrong with not being white, because typically it comes out of, again, as you say, if you were raised with it and maybe have some of it, it's not that it's only white folks that do this, but it tends to be a very kind of whitened way of seeing that there's something wrong with difference. We shouldn't talk about it. And so then it also, the third very serious thing it does for kids is, if we want our children to be able to challenge racism, grow an anti-racist moral imagination, that rests on the condition that they can see race and talk about race in meaningful ways. And if we've just said, don't be colorblind, everybody's the same, we've literally disabled the possibility of them building toolkits to grow anti-racist moral imagination. We can't do that if our kids can't talk about race, and we can't talk about race without talking about difference. Well, then I shouldn't be surprised when I get 19-year-old college students, white students in a class with Black students and Latino students and Asian American students. And my white students are like, what do you mean racism is real? It's just developmentally, powerfully harmful.
I guess one other way of asking this question is what's so attractive about this idea of colorblindness? Like we hear from politicians all the time, I don't see race, I don't see color. And that's their way of saying I'm a progressive, or I'm not a racist, I guess is what they're trying to say.
Yeah.
And so what's really drawing us to that kind of language? Like I've been drawn to that language. And so why is that the case?
A lot of times I think when we're saying be colorblind, what we are saying is everybody has innate dignity, everyone has innate equality, and so everyone deserves innate respect regardless of differences. And so I think what we don't hear is that to say that is a very different thing than to say, be colorblind and don't notice their differences, right? And so I think we've actually made those synonyms, and then by doing that have confused our children. And so I think the values, so I can say to my kids, as a family, we value equality. We believe everyone has innate dignity, regardless of who they are in terms of race, religion, name, place of origin, whatever. And then we need to take the second step and say, the reality is, though, we live in a world or a society where not everyone experiences that respect, right? So everyone is innately equal, but not everyone experiences equality out in the world. And those are two very different messages. And we've sort of flattened them into, we're all equal, so therefore be colorblind. So we think we're trying to teach respect, that we don't sort of put people's individual particularness sort of in a column that says, therefore they're a different kind of person, whether good or bad, right? But it's a shorthand that just doesn't work. So we can say, we believe in the humanity of all people. Yes, of course, that's a value I ascribe to, the innate dignity of all human beings, regardless of race, gender, religion, etc. Have you ever met a person who didn't have a gender, a race, a name, a hair texture? We have never met that person, right? We always engage and experience people's humanity through the particularities in which they show up. And so it's this complicated way that our kids, we're using these really abstract universal categories that even we adults don't really operate from. Like I can say I value humanity, but I only experience human beings through all our beautiful differences, right? And so our kids need us to break that down for them a little bit if we are committed to their anti-racist moral capacity.
The alternative you give for colorblind parenting, and I think we've been sort of talking about it a little bit, but the term you use is race-conscious parenting. I'd love for you to talk about what it means to be race-conscious for us as people, and then what it looks like to use that as a vehicle for parenting.
I like the language of race-conscious because it assumes that we want our children and we ourselves need to be conscious and aware of race. We need to and should talk about race. We should observe difference and engage questions of difference. I want them to be able to do that with communities of color. I want them as white US Americans to be able to be in relationships of solidarity and allyship and meaningful action